Whatever you do, trust your instruments. That's something that's been hammered into all pilots during initial training, but what happens when they should actually do the complete opposite? Will someone speak up then, and what would happen if they do? Stay tuned. The 14th of November 1990, Milan Linate Airport in northern Italy. It was a cloudy, early afternoon when two pilots from Alitalia stepped out of their taxi and proceeded into the terminal building of Milan's, at the time relatively newly renovated, second airport. These pilots had already flown a couple of flights together on the previous day, so they knew each other relatively well, and they were now getting ready to operate 4 more evening legs together. At around 1300 local time, they entered the crew room and started looking through their pre-flight briefing material, and as they were doing that, they were told that the aircraft that they were going to fly, a sleek 16-year-old McDonnell Douglas DC-9, was already waiting for them out on the apron. The pilots acknowledged this while continuing to look through the weather, NOTAMs and flight plans for the coming 4 flights, where the first one would take them from Milan Linate over to Frankfurt in Germany. They would then operate back to Linate, followed by 2 shorter flights to Zurich and back, a pretty standard, relatively short day if everything went according to plan. The weather north of the Alps looked a little bit cloudy with some rain showers and light westerly winds at both of their destinations, but the visibility was generally good. The only issue was that it looked like some fog might be forming over Linate on their last leg, which of course could cause some issues. Apart from that though, there were no real problems expected, so the pilots soon walked over to their 4 cabin crew to brief them about what they could expect from the day. The captain was a 47-year-old Italian citizen with around 10,200 hours of total time. He had started his career in the military but had then joined Italy's flag carrier, Alitalia, where he had flown on the DC-8, DC-9 and the Boeing 727 before finally getting his command on the DC-9. This meant that he had just under 3,200 hours of experience on this particular type, but only around 1,200 hours as captain on it. His colleague, the first officer for this day, was significantly less experienced, with a total time of only 831 hours. He was also Italian and, at the time of these flights, 28 years old and had started his professional flying career during the previous summer, after having gone through Alitalia's own flight academy. Now, we don't really know how well these pilots had worked together during the previous day, but given the large difference in experience and the captain's earlier military background, it's likely that the authority gradient was quite steep here. In any case, as soon as the pre-flight briefing was completed, they all proceeded together out to the aircraft, which had arrived into Linate earlier in the morning. And when the captain entered the cockpit and started looking through the tech log, he saw that the previous captain had written down 2 remarks. Both of them having to do with the navigational and autopilot system. The first one read, VHF nav 2. In radio selected position 2, VHF nav 2 does not give a to from indication on HSI 2, and in position approach, no to from indication on HSI 2 either. And the second remark read, Cat 2 simulated approach. At 200 feet, the autopilot had a tendency to fly under the glide path, then return to it, followed by an accentuated dive. The autopilot was switched off and we continued flying manually. When the engineers in Leonardo were advised of these issues, they had started by swapping the 2 nav radio receivers around to see if that would rectify the failure. And after that, they had allowed the aircraft to dispatch after having downgraded it to Cat 1 approaches only. This is a pretty strange thing to do, but I guess they just wanted to verify if it was the receivers or the instruments that were causing the problems, and it formed part of a redundant system anyway. So apart from those issues, the aircraft was in good working order, and after having completed their setup, the crew departed on their first flight at time 14:07, initially without any further issues. Now, we don't know who was pilot flying and pilot monitoring on those 2 first flights, but given how we pilots normally operate, it's likely that the captain flew the first leg and that the first officer then flew the middle 2, because we know that he was pilot flying for the 3rd flight when the real trouble started. In any case, the only technical issue noted after the first flight over to Frankfurt was a broken ground floodlight, which then had to be changed during the turnaround. But during the second flight back towards Linate, those same issues with the navigation radios were observed once again. Only this time, the failure occurred when the nav selector was set to radio 1 instead of radio 2 as indicated previously. So what did that mean then? Well, to understand this, we have to have a closer look at navigational radios on the DC-9 as well as the way that the system had been set up. And this is a little bit complex, so bear with me. There were two VHF navigational radios fitted, which could be tuned to receive signals from VOR stations. These are omnidirectional beacons who sends out information about on which exact bearing an aircraft is from the beacon using something known as radials. There are 360 radios available, as many as there are degrees on a circle in other words, and with the help of the course selectors on the aircraft horizontal situation indicator, HSI instruments, specific radials can then be chosen to navigate on. But of course, in order to use those radials, it is important to know what direction the aircraft is traveling, since it could be situated on the same radial either going towards or from the beacon. And that was the indication that both the previous crew and now these pilots had observed malfunctioning on one of the receivers. Now, on top of receiving VOR signals, these nav radios could also be set to receive signals from an ILS transmitter, which sends out localizer signals to help guide the aircraft down towards a runway, and glide slope signals to guide the aircraft horizontally down towards the touchdown zone. But what did that nav switching unit that was mentioned in the tech log do then? Well, basically, it decided which information from what navigation radio would be transmitted to the pilot instruments. With the switch on radio 1, all instruments, meaning the HSI 1 and 2, and the automatic direction indicator, ADI 1 and 2, would receive their signals from nav receiver 1. And subsequently, on radio 2, the opposite would happen, and all instruments would get their signals from radio 2 instead. But when the switch was set on approach, the captain's instruments, HSI and ADI-1, would get their signals from nav radio 1, and the first officer's instruments would get their signals from nav radio 2. That way, there would be a split in information on approach, which could help in identifying any failures. There was also another feature of these navigational radios that would soon come to play a huge role. But before I explain what I mean by that, it's important to point out that we pilots rely on many different types of technology all the time in order to make sure that we keep both our passengers, you guys, and ourselves safe. Now, as a passenger, you normally won't be dealing with quite as high stakes, but we all rely on the technology around us to work in order for our daily lives to function. So when you find yourself without, for example, an internet connection, it can be hugely disruptive and frustrating, which is why I am so happy to present Saily as today's sponsor. Think of Saily as your reliable travel companion that will easily and affordably make sure that you always have a working internet connection wherever you travel. And that's without the hassle of having to deal with physical SIM cards. Saily currently have available eSIM plans in over 150 different countries, and it works flawlessly on both iOS and Android. Setting it up is super simple. You just download the Saily app, find your plan, download and install the eSIM, and then activate. Voila! Your phone has affordable internet whenever you reach your destination, and the tip there is to activate it before your plane even takes off from home. I have used it extensively when I first moved to Andorra and also in Dubai, and it has worked flawlessly every single time. So if you want to stay connected without any hassle, save some money and also skip replacing your SIM card, then use this QR code or head over to saily.com/pilot and use my code PILOT for 15% off your first purchase. That's saily.com/pilot with the code PILOT from the description here below. Thank you, Saily. Now, what was that feature of the navigational radios that I was talking about? Like I mentioned before, the nav radios also had another feature that would soon come into play here, and it was the fault monitoring. You see, the way that these old analog instruments worked was by continuously doing self-tests on their own output. And if a fault was found, the associated instrument indicator would retract and be replaced by a failure flag, letting the pilots know that this part of the instrument couldn't be relied on. This was obviously super important, but around the year 1975, so well before this flight took place, it had been found that certain nav radio receivers had a little quirk in them. You see, a major disadvantage with the analog ILS systems was that when no output signal was produced by the nav receiver, well then the same indication was given by the instruments as if the aircraft was perfectly aligned with the correct signal. And this could occur if a short circuit or signal break would happen between the receiver output and the instrument, for example. Now, most nav receivers had therefore been modified to show a failure flag if that would happen, but not all of them. Like I said, this had been highlighted back in 1975, and in case of the unmonitored Collins 51 RV2 Bravo units, it had been advised that the 108 variants should be upgraded to the 109 variants instead, who didn't have this problem. But not all operators had actually followed that advice. So when in 1984, Douglas also issued an all-operator letter highlighting the possibility of a frozen glide slope or localizer indication, they had assumed that all Collins variants had been upgraded after that 1975 memo, and therefore didn't include those receivers in the affected receivers group. Now, the dangers of these frozen indications were also then further highlighted in a seminar in 1985 over in the United States, where pilots from Alitalia had actually attended, but not much information about this particular threat had then trickled down to the line pilots. Now, it should be mentioned here that approaches were normally flown with a nav switching unit in the approach setting, meaning that each pilot would receive inputs from their own specific nav receivers, and in that case there was also a comparator active between the instruments who would activate a warning if the two pilots got significantly different signals on their instruments. And that meant that the risk of a failure like this was deemed as reasonably small. Anyway, this was just some background information that is important to have as we go further into this story. When the aircraft had arrived onto stand 16 in Linate, the captain called up the maintenance engineers and advised them that the nav receiver swap had not worked. The failure had just come back again, but this time on the opposite side, which was kind of expected. As a response to that, the engineers decided to exchange both nav receivers, and they ended up installing a King receiver, a KNR 6030 in the nav1 slot, and a Collins 51 RV2 Bravo in nav2, both of which were of the non-monitored type, something that the pilots obviously had no idea of. Anyway, once this switch had been completed, the engineers went through the testing sequence needed after every time that a new nav receiver had been installed. And this meant that they checked the function of both boxes against the Linate VOR as well as the Linate localizer. But due to the location of the stand that the aircraft was on, they were not able to test the reception of the ILS glide slope signal. Now, all of the other tests passed without a problem, so the aircraft was once again released back to service, but this time with a note to the pilots in the tech log asking them to complete an automatic approach at their destination in order to reactivate the Category 3 status of the aircraft. This was important since the fog was now expected on the return leg from their fourth flight. And the pilots, they just acknowledged this information and then continued with their setup. The first officer was going to be pilot flying over to Zurich, so he proceeded with the departure briefing at the same time as the 40 passengers who were booked on the flight were welcomed on board by the cabin crew. All in all, there were 46 people on board when Alitalia Flight 404 started taxiing out for departure for runway 36 right. At time 18:36 local time, the first officer stabilized the engines and then moved the thrust levers into the takeoff thrust setting, which caused the mighty DC-9 to start roaring down the runway. The takeoff and departure was then completed normally, seemingly without any issues with the navigational equipment. The climb continued into the now almost dark northern sky, with the aircraft soon reaching its planned cruising altitude of flight level 200, which is about 20,000 feet. Just high enough to safely overfly the peaks of the Alps between Milan and Zurich, but not higher due to the short planned duration of the flight. And because of that, only about 2 minutes after the aircraft had reached its cruise altitude, the captain switched on the Volmet frequency to copy down the weather for their destination. The surface wind in Zurich was reported as 240 degrees at 8 knots, which caused the captain to assume that they would be forced to circle around to runway 28 instead of landing straight in from the ILS to runway 14 as they had planned to do. But a few minutes later, they were also able to listen to the ATIS information, which included that runway 14 was still in use for landing. Now, even though that was the case, the cockpit voice recorder still showed that the captain insisted on including the relatively complicated circling maneuver in the approach briefing. I'm not against mentally preparing for all eventualities, especially since the wind was approaching 10 knots of tailwind here, but it's also important to keep the approach briefing as brief and relevant as possible, since the briefing forms a really important part in creating a mental picture about the procedure that is about to be flown. Now, all discussions in the cockpit were done in Italian, but from the translated report there was a strong sense of a pretty steep power gradient in the cockpit, with the captain adopting a kind of instructional tone to the first officer. Now, that probably wouldn't have been that rare in the early 1990s, but we will soon see why it is so important to keep these kind of tendencies under control. Having said that though, there did seem to be some reasons behind the captain's instructional attitude here. The first officer continued his briefing, but it sounds like he was looking at the wrong approach plate, since he read out the outer marker crossing height for runway 16 instead of for runway 14, which they were actually going for. There was also a lengthy discussion about the procedure to follow in case of a loss of communication, which is rarely a good use of time during a short flight like this. That time would have been better spent properly checking at what altitude and distance the glide slope should be intercepted, as well as the actual outer marker crossing height. You see, generally speaking, following an ILS is pretty straightforward. The HSI instruments and flight director will show the localizer and glide slope indicator, as well as how to fly to follow them, and if everything looks okay, there should rarely be any real issues. But there had of course been rare instances of false glide slopes being captured, so a way of verifying that this was not the case had also been implemented. The easiest way to do that was to make sure that the aircraft was at the correct altitude and distance when the glide slope was intercepted, and then to monitor the descent rate, which should normally remain between 700 and 900 feet per minute. Then there also needed to be a cross-check of the glide slope altitude at the outer marker, or at an equivalent distance, again to verify that the instruments were showing the correct thing. But here another issue comes in, one that had to do with the altimeters that were fitted onto this particular DC-9. You see, they were using a clock face with a dial showing hundreds of feet between 1 and 9, and then an inner drum pointer to show thousands of feet. This might seem logical, but this drum was quite small, and this setup required the pilots to look at their altimeters in two different steps, once for the hundreds of feet and then once for the thousands. And because of this and the small scale of the drum, these altimeters had already been shown to be very prone to misreadings by the pilots. And that's also a detail that's worth remembering. In any case, the aircraft soon started descending and then got into contact with Zurich Control, who asked them what their current heading was. When they responded that they were flying on 350 degrees, the controller asked them to turn slightly left to 340 degrees instead, and then continue the descent to initially flight level 140. During the descent, the captain took the latest ATIS information again, information echo, which still indicated that the ILS for runway 14 was in use with a wind of 250 degrees, 7 knots, visibility 10 kilometers in mist with few clouds at 1500 feet and broken clouds at 3000 and 4000 feet. Quite good weather, in other words. The pilots now still continued to discuss the approach at some length, and they were soon handed over to the approach controller, who told them to descend further down to flight level 100 initially. The captain read this back, and at around time 1900, the first officer asked if they should do a practice Cat 2 approach like the engineers had asked for. The captain agreed with this, since they still needed to test the system in order to get the aircraft back to Cat 3 status for the return flight, but curiously, there was then no discussion about how to fly that approach and the special procedures that this would come with, except for the minimas which the pilots did set. Now, when flying a Category 2 approach, there are typically quite a few extra call-outs and procedures needed, and that would have been much more relevant to discuss than the loss of comm procedures and other tiny details that they had been focusing on up until this point. So, all in all, the impression that I got from this crew was that they were maybe a little bit unfocused and didn't really follow their standard operating procedures to the letter, but they also largely maintained a pretty professional attitude and mainly discussed only operational things as the descent continued. It also seems like it was around this point that the first officer finally realized that he had been looking at the wrong approach chart, since his Category 2 minimas didn't match the captain's. And that then led to a further discussion about the missed approach procedure, which he had briefed for the wrong runway and the captain had just misunderstood. It's also worth pointing out here that we try to avoid, when possible, to do any briefings during the descent. And that's because it can cause quite a bit of distraction, especially in busy environments with a lot of traffic and terrain around, which certainly was the case here. Now, it is not always possible to avoid this, especially on shorter flights, but if it has to be done, it needs to be correct and brief. Anyway, the aircraft was now told to turn onto heading of 325 degrees for radar vectors for the ILS approach runway 14 and also to descend to flight level 90. And around 2 minutes later, the aircraft passed a beam the airport where the captain called out, "We're passing a beam Kloten at flight level 90. We're being kept high." And this is important to point out because it gives us an understanding of how the pilot's situational awareness was here. Remember, they had not been given any information about how many track miles of radar vectors they could expect, so the captain couldn't really know if they were high or low at this point. But since he perceived being high, it likely had an impact on what was soon about to happen. When the aircraft had descended through flight level 100, the first officer had reduced the speed back to 250 knots, like the rules stipulated. But even though he did that, the captain soon started telling him to slow down even further, since a high speed at this point would only mean that they got further away from the airport. Again, the tone used by the captain here was clearly instructional, but this was not a training flight, so it's likely that the first officer didn't really appreciate this very much. In any case, the approach controller soon also came in and told them to reduce their speed to 210 knots and to descend to flight level 60, likely to try and fit them into the arrival pattern, which was very busy with several other flights receiving radar vectors at the same time. The crew did this and then discussed briefly the use of anti-ice, which they decided was not needed. And the captain then pointed out something that was going to become very important. He suddenly said that the outer marker was at 1,200 feet and could be identified by the distance 3.8 miles from Kloten VOR. Now, the correct crossing altitude was actually 1,248 feet QFE, meaning above the airport, and the distance was from the ILS, not the Kloten VOR, but the captain probably just rounded the altitude off and then misread the identifier. And this altitude cross-check would soon become crucial. It is likely that the captain pointed this out, since the first officer had previously been briefing from the wrong approach chart, and therefore he was now cross-checking basically everything before the start of the approach. We don't really know. But we do know that both pilots were aware of the importance of this minimum height at 3.8 miles. It is also worth pointing out that the procedure at Alitalia at the time was for the pilot monitoring, the captain in this case, to set QFE, meaning the pressure setting adjusted to show the altitude above the airfield. And the pilot flying would then keep QNH, meaning the pressure setting showing the altitude above the sea, until on final approach, where he would set QFE as well. This was a quite complicated altimeter setting procedure that almost no one uses today. Now we all just use QNH all the time in order to minimize the risk of making mistakes. Anyway, 2 minutes later, the approach controller told the aircraft to turn right onto heading of 070 degrees, which the captain read back. And this meant that they were now starting to receive vectors onto a base leg for the coming approach. About a minute later, the controller also told them to descend to 4,000 feet, to turn right onto 110 degrees, and that they were now cleared for the ILS approach for runway 14 on that heading. And now several critical things happened very fast. First of all, the 4,000 feet that they had been cleared to descend to was, according to the chart, supposed to be maintained until a distance of 8 miles from the ILS. That's where the correct glide slope would be intercepted and therefore the earliest point where an approach descent could start. But the way that the autopilot on the DC-9 worked when the approach mode was activated and an ILS glide slope was sensed was that it would start descending with 700 feet per minute for 10 seconds and would then couple with the sensed glide slope. Now, the way that this crew had set up their nav radios was that the first officer had tuned the Kloten VOR on his side, nav receiver 2, with a course of 138 for the coming potential missed approach. And the captain has set his nav receiver, number 1, to the ILS and the inbound course of 138 degrees. And do you remember that nav switching unit that I talked about before? Well, when nav 1 had been selected to approach, the nav 2 would automatically tune the ILS frequency from nav 1, but it would still have the VOR frequency shown and ready in case of a missed approach, and the DME2 would also use the distance from the VOR, not the ILS. But this also meant that both receivers would now independently show the ILS signals to the pilots, with the comparator ready to send out a warning if there was any discrepancies sensed between them. And something had now happened inside of nav receiver number 1. We will never know exactly what, but for some reason, maybe a short circuit or something, a null signal was now being sent to the glide slope indicator on the captain's side, whilst the localizer worked completely fine. And since this particular receiver did not have a flag warning when this happened, the result was that whilst the localizer activated correctly and showed the aircraft how it was closing in on the center line, the glide slope was also erroneously shown as centered, meaning on the glide slope with no flags attached to it. But the first officer's nav receiver had no such issues, so whilst it also showed the localizer coming in, the glide slope indicator was being hidden at the top, out of view since they were still far away from the actual glide slope. Now remember how earlier I pointed out that the captain had felt that they were being kept high? Well, it's likely that he still had that feeling in the back of his mind here, so when he looked down onto his instruments and saw that they were just on the glide, it would have likely made sense to him, even though the DME distance shown would have been far greater than the 8 miles where the intercept should have taken place. At the same time, the flight director selector had been selected to norm, which was shown as NL arm on the flight mode annunciator, and as expected, the comparator now felt the difference between the left and the right HSI and therefore activated the comparator warning light. This prompted the first officer to ask, "Do you have the glide?" To which the captain responded, "On 1," likely referring to the fact that he could see what he thought was the glide slope indication on his instruments. Only 5 seconds later, the first officer then added, "I don't have it," since the glide correctly on his side had not yet started to show. And this prompted the captain to finally say, "Good, let's do it on 1." Now, this just makes the hair stand up on my arms when I tell this story, because this is exactly the time where the last couple of holes in the Swiss cheese model started to line up. The first officer now agreed with what the captain had just suggested and told him to switch over the nav switching unit to radio 1 instead of keeping it on approach. And this immediately commanded all 4 navigational instruments to start taking their information from the faulty nav 1 receiver. And since it was still showing that centered glide slope, that's what now appeared on the first officer's side as well. And the comparator warning disappeared. Now, if you think that this sounds crazy, I would completely agree. I have no idea how a system could be allowed to function this way, but the likelihood is that approaches should have been flown only with approach mode set. And this knee-jerk reaction to just switch the unit over to 1 was just a way to provide a quick fix to a highly confusing situation. The problem was, of course, that whilst this looked like it sorted out the issue, the only thing it really did was to make a small problem bigger, whilst also allowing the system to almost completely mask it. The first officer now called for flaps 15 to be selected, whilst also arming the ILS on the autopilot, and this caused the autopilot to immediately change its descent rate from 1,150 feet per minute as selected in vertical speed before, to 700 feet per minute in line with the glide path capture logic. And at the same time, it also captured the localizer after a slight overshoot to the left side of the center line. Now the problem here was that the aircraft was still a full 1,500 feet below the actual glide slope here, something that the crew should have noticed if they would have looked at the DME, which was still showing over 12 miles out, not the 8 miles where the glide slope intercept should have happened. And here it's worth talking a little bit about how pilots should deal with strange indications and unexpected failure flags in the cockpit. When something happens that we don't understand or we're expecting, it's super important to ask ourselves why, and then methodically try to figure out what we're dealing with. The most efficient way of doing that is for the pilot flying to continue to concentrate on flying the airplane and just ask the pilot monitoring to state the malfunction. This should then prompt the pilot monitoring to start looking around at all the indications and try to figure out what systems are involved and if there are any emergency checklists that needs to be done. Now, this might mean that an approach clearance needs to be cancelled and that the aircraft needs to take up a hold or ask for delaying vectors, but it is always worth doing that instead of just pushing along and hoping for the best. In this case, for example, a slight delay would have enabled the captain to compare the indications of the first officer's HSI and his own, and together with the DME distance indication, that would have likely showed him that his glide slope indication was the incorrect one. That would have been especially prudent to do here, since there had been recent work carried out on the navigational radios, and if that would have been done, this approach could have likely still continued, using the first officer's instruments and then by closely cross-checking distances versus altitudes. Obviously, a Category 2 approach couldn't have been done with this failure, but that consideration was not even discussed by this crew. Instead, flap 15 was now selected and the captain called out localizer capture and glide path capture. So we are on the beam, a little bit off track, but referring to the small overshoot that you can both see. As the aircraft was now established on the glide slope, the first officer set the QFE of 970 hectopascals on his altimeter as well, and then called this out to the captain. The aircraft soon descended through 3,700 feet, which caused an altitude warning since the MCP altitude was still set at 4,000 feet. And the captain just responded to that warning by saying, I cancel and set 5,000 feet, referring to the go-around altitude. All of these actions together confirms that the crew was now convinced that they were following correct ILS indications here. And the fact that the localizer clearly was correct would have likely but just reinforced this feeling. This is actually a great example of confirmation bias, where someone chooses to prioritize information that confirms their understanding of a situation and then disregards anything that speaks against it. Like the fact that they were clearly much further away from the runway than they should be, and that they had received that comparator warning before switching over to Nav Radio 1. Anyway, the aircraft continued to descend, maintaining an altitude of about 1,200 feet below the real glide slope, and whilst not good, this would likely not have become such a huge problem if it wasn't for a few other very unfortunate factors here. You see, the terrain around Zurich is quite high, and at about 5 miles out on final runway 14, there was a small mountain known as Stadlerberg. This hill was not high enough to cause any real problems, providing that the normal glide slope was maintained, but if an aircraft was flying far below the glide, it could cause two different issues. First, the DME, or distance signal, could become interrupted, making it hard to do the required altitude cross-check that I talked about before. And second, during darkness, if the aircraft was flying low enough, the mountain could actually block the view of the runway. The Stadlerberg was at this time completely unlit, with no obstacle lights on it, so it would then just appear as a giant black shadow ahead of the aircraft, something known as the black hole effect. Now, this mountain was clearly shown on the official AIP approach charts for Zurich, but Alitalia were using their own, slightly simplified versions of these charts, where the terrain features on the profile view had been removed. Around the time the captain reset the MCP altitude to 5,000 feet, the landing gear must have also been selected down, but there were no calls about that in the cockpit. We know that it must have come down here, because when the first officer called for flaps 25 to be selected, there was no warning horn sounding, which there would have been if the gear was still up. Now, if the captain selected the gear down here, it also matches up with what he did next, which was to tell the first officer to continue reducing his speed, as the captain felt that they were now getting a bit close to the traffic ahead of them on final. He then continued that remark by calling out that the outer marker check was to be at 1,250 feet, which was correct, but at that time they were already descending through 1,600 feet, with still more than 4 miles left to the outer marker location. Now, some of you might be wondering what ATC were doing here, and that would be a good question. Normally, the approach controller would have to confirm with the crew that they were established on the ILS if the crew didn't report that themselves. But at the time, there was no specific requirement for the controller to monitor the aircraft's altitude once it had been cleared for the ILS. And in this case, even though the crew never formally reported that they were stabilized, nor were they asked about it, it likely wouldn't have made much of a difference, since the crew would have happily just confirmed it. There was also no low-altitude warning installed for the controller to warn if an aircraft was descending below the safe approach altitude, something that most major airports have installed today. So the combination of all of these factors now led to only one single warning system remaining between the aircraft and disaster, and that was the ground proximity warning system, which I will get back to shortly. In any case, the aircraft just continued to descend down the erroneous glide slope, constantly staying around 1,200 feet below the real glide, since the autopilot just continued descending with 700 feet per minute as per its logic. The first officer soon called for "Flaps 50, that's set," which was the planned landing flaps and quickly selected by the captain. And at this point, they also passed 8 miles, which was where they were supposed to descend from 4,000 feet. Or 2,598 feet on their QFE set altimeters, but their actual height at this point was now around 1,100 feet. And now the first signs of some doubts could possibly be noticed from the crew. Because the captain suddenly called out, "It's about 3.8 miles left to the outer marker," at which point they should be almost 150 feet higher than what they now were. And at time 19:10 and 27 seconds, the first officer then asked if they had already passed the outer marker, which he then repeated a few seconds later. And he likely asked that because of the strange altitude indications that he was now seeing. But the captain only responded that, no, it hasn't changed yet, which probably meant that he could see that they were still outside of the marker position, even though this was kind of a strange way of saying that. He soon also followed up that remark by saying that they were still at 7 miles, likely as part of an analysis of what he was seeing, as it now clearly made less and less sense to him. But the still correct-looking ILS indication likely held the crew's situational awareness in a tight grip here. And just as the captain started seriously looking into what might be wrong, he was interrupted by a call from the approach controller, who told them to reduce speed on their own discretion and to change over to the tower frequency of 118.1. And that call probably interrupted the captain from considering his doubts any further. They were now below 1,000 feet, still well outside of the outer marker position, with the Stadlerberg looming like a huge black shadow in front of them. And those of you who have been paying attention would have noticed that the weather wasn't actually that bad, so at this point they should have been out of the clouds and therefore able to see how low they were. But because they were now so far below the glide, they might have actually entered into some lower stratus clouds coming off the mountain itself, and in any case, the approach and runway lights were now all hidden from them behind the mountain. So what about the GPWS system then, the ground proximity warning system? Surely it should activate in a situation like this. Well, first of all, this aircraft was equipped with the old type of GPWS, which reacted mainly to terrain closure rates and did not have a built-in terrain database as today's aircraft do. And secondly, since the gear was down and the flaps were set for landing, this system would have been programmed to activate only for the following criteria. Mode 1. Excessive descent rate, which the aircraft didn't have since it was descending with 700 feet per minute. Mode 2 Bravo, which included excessive terrain closure rate measured from the radio altimeter, and in this case that would have needed to be more than 4,000 feet per minute, but since the mountain was still ahead of them, this didn't apply here either. And then finally Mode 5, which would have highlighted the aircraft flying excessively below the glide slope. But since that mode was connected to the ILS instrument, which was showing the aircraft following the glide slope perfectly, it didn't activate either. So at this point, all of the technical safety barriers had been crossed, and that left only one, the pilots themselves, the only system on board that could self-calibrate and therefore possibly stop a disaster from happening. And these pilots were now really starting to dislike what they were seeing. At time 19:10 and 56 seconds, the captain could be heard saying, "That doesn't make sense to me," followed by the first officer responding, "Nor to me." And only a second later, the captain called out, "Pull, pull, pull!" followed by the sound of the autopilot disconnecting. Now that sounds great, but unfortunately this probably wasn't because the captain had understood just how critical the situation actually was. Instead, it's more likely that he was looking down at his altimeter, seeing 300 feet on the dial, and then misread the drum part as being above 1000 feet rather than below. This meant that he probably thought that they were at 1300 feet and therefore wanted to just pull up in order to level off for a bit until they passed the 4 miles outer marker at the correct altitude. Now, a quick look over at his radio altimeter would have shown that the aircraft was indeed at around 350 feet here, with the mountain quickly approaching, but that didn't happen. But in any case, the first officer had now had enough, and as the aircraft passed about 6 miles, he initiated a go-around with a clear command, "Go around!" whilst also started to move the thrust levers forward and pitching the aircraft up to about 5.4 degrees. Later analysis showed that if this go-around would have been allowed to go ahead, the aircraft would have been able to just clear the mountain. But sadly, the captain now intervened. Remember, he still thought that they were just a little bit low. So he called out, No, catch the glide!" likely still looking at his false glide slope indication in front of him. And possibly due to that high cockpit gradient that I mentioned before, the first officer now complied and lowered nose. A few seconds later, the captain called out, "Can you hold it?" To which the first officer replied, "Yes." And that was then immediately followed by the radio altimeter warning that they were now only 200 feet above ground. The last words captured on the cockpit voice recorder was the captain saying, "Hold on, let's try," before, at time 19:11 and 19 seconds, the aircraft violently impacted the northern slope of the Stadlerberg, breaking into pieces and causing a violent fire which claimed the lives of all 46 people on board. Now, since no radio calls had been made, the traffic continued normally into Zurich while the approach and tower controller tried to figure out where Flight 404 had gone. Remember, they had been asked to switch over but had never established contact again. But quite soon, an approaching aircraft reported a big fire on the approach path below them, making the painful truth obvious to everyone. The airport was immediately closed and all traffic was redirected, but by the time the rescue personnel were able to reach the accident site, there was absolutely nothing they could do. The accident investigation got underway immediately and pretty soon honed in on the details that I have just described to you. The causes of the accident was deemed to have been a false indication on the VHF Nav Unit 1, made worse by a possible misreading of the captain's altimeter. The fact that this failure had not been noticed by the pilots was caused by inadequate failure analysis when the comparator warning went off, together with non-compliance with approach procedures and less than perfect crew coordination. Now, the fact that the captain then stopped the first officer's decision to go around likely directly led to the final impact. This accident led to several really important recommendations that still resonates throughout the pilot community today. Obviously, one of them was that nav equipment without proper failure monitoring should not be allowed to be used, and the same went for those drum pointer altimeters, which had already been proven to be prone to crew misinterpretation even before this flight. There were also a further 13 recommendations added aimed at air traffic control and the charts used, among other things. But the single most important point raised was that if a go-around has been initiated by any pilot in a situation where the position is in doubt, it must be flown to completion with no questions asked. And if you are a pilot out there watching this video, that's what I want you to remember. Now, I hope that you found this video interesting, and if you want to help me continue to produce videos like this and also get to watch them before anyone else, then please join my Patreon crew by going to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. You can also help us by supporting our sponsor, whose QR code is up here, and there's a link also here in the description below, which will give you a very special deal. Now, check out this video next, which is really interesting, I promise you that. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.